Christopher Durocher, Director of Policy Development Programming at the American Constitution Society. For those of you who don't know ACS, it's a national network of lawyers, scholars, law students, judges, and policymakers who believe the law should be a force to improve the lives of all people. ACS works for positive change by shaping debate on vitally important legal and constitutional issues. On behalf of ACS, I'd like to thank you for joining us today. I'd like to thank our panelists and our moderator, and I'd like to extend a special thanks to Congressman Hank Johnson for sponsoring this event and for his staff for their help in pulling this together. This summer, in response to the shooting death of Michael Brown by a police officer in Ferguson, Missouri, protesters took to the streets of Ferguson, decrying both the city's ineffectual response to Mike Brown's death and the larger pattern of racially charged police abuses that have plagued St. Louis County for years. In response to these protests, police in Ferguson revealed something that most Americans were previously unaware of, that the police are looking less and less like officers of the peace and looking more like paramilitary forces, complete with tactical body armor, high-powered rifles, grenade launchers, sound cannons, and enormous armored vehicles that the average person would consider practically tanks. But this trend isn't new. Beginning with the more frequent use of SWAT teams and the subsequent declaration of a war on drugs in the 1980s, police departments around the country slowly acquired equipment and weapons traditionally reserved for soldiers. In the last decade, large cities and small towns have been drafted into the war on terror, with billions of dollars worth of equipment and money being provided through a variety of programs at the Defense Department, Homeland Security, and the Justice Department. This has transformed many of even the smallest police forces, giving them access to military-grade equipment for which they would otherwise have no need. Today's panel is going to take a look at how we got here and the effect that these changes have had on the way the police and the public view their role as officers of the peace. But first, I'd like to introduce the host of today's event, Congressman Johnson. In his fourth term as U.S. Representative for Georgia's 4th Congressional District, Congressman Johnson is a member of the House Armed Services Committee and Judiciary Committee, on which he serves as the ranking member of the Regulatory Reform, Commercial, and Antitrust Law Subcommittee. He has also previously served as the chair of the Judiciary Committee's Subcommittee on Courts and Competition Policy, as regional whip on the House leadership team, and whip of the Progressive Caucus. During his time here, Congressman Johnson has distinguished himself as a substantive, hardworking legislator who champions a variety of issues, including consumer protection, immigration reform, education, civil liberties, support for public safety, and the welfare of our nation's veterans. In September, Congressman Johnson introduced the bipartisan Stop Militarizing Law Enforcement Act, which would amend the Department of Defense program that transfers surplus military equipment to federal and state agencies for law enforcement activities. Explaining the need for this legislation, which Congressman Johnson prepared well before the events of Ferguson brought the issue to national attention, he told his colleagues, before another small-town police force gets a $700,000 gift from the Department of Defense that it can't maintain or manage, it behooves us to rein in this program and revisit the merits of a militarized America. Please join me in welcoming Congressman Hank Johnson.
Good afternoon, everybody. I was telling Chris that this whole saga began for me back on December the 10th of 2013. I was at a Christmas parade that was hosted by a very small municipality in my district. That municipality shall remain nameless at this time, but it's got about maybe 4 or 5 square miles of territory and maybe about 4 or 5 police officers, 3 of whom serve part-time on the police department there. And this was a nighttime parade that my position as congressman was to be in the car behind the mayor's vehicle. And so I usually go to those parades and instead of being in the car, I like to be able to touch, you know, the citizens, give the kids some candy, you know, shake hands and everything like that. And so that's what my intent was. I didn't have a car. And so I ended up walking right behind the mayor's vehicle. And the mayor was seated in a great big armored vehicle with a gun turret. And so here I am, a little small civilian, happened to serve on the House Armed Services Committee. And I'm walking behind this great big armored vehicle that I could not see over or the sides of. You know, I mean, it was just so massive and the tires were so big. And I was like blown away by this vehicle. And so I asked the mayor, you know, what do you use this vehicle for? And she said, oh, well, you know, when there are some snow, when there's snow events or you know, ice storms, we can pull cars out of ditches with this piece of equipment. And I thought to myself, well, this is a pretty expensive tow truck. But at any rate, I was so much in awe of this vehicle that I asked my staff to check into it and see how could the municipality have acquired this vehicle for that purpose. And so staff began looking around and they found reports of missing equipment under the 1033 program, the surplus military weaponry clause of the National Defense Authorization Act of 1995. They saw where some of this equipment that had been transferred to state and local municipalities had turned up missing. And that kind of got me alarmed. I started thinking about domestic insurrection and what would happen if that kind of equipment in massive volumes got into the wrong hands and you know, fermented domestic violence, insurrection. And so we were looking at it from that standpoint, but then we ended up doing an op-ed with a gentleman from USA Today. I don't recall his name. Scott. Michael Shank. Ended up doing an op-ed with Michael Shank, and then we started preparing legislation to look at this 1033 program, and the legislation had been through a number of iterations. Working with ACLU, and I'm sorry, ma'am, your name?
Kara.
Kara. Working with Kara and others on the legislation, and you know, viewing the report that the ACLU had issued on this issue, and so things were moving along. We got to the recess period in August. Got to the August recess period, and our intent was to introduce the legislation during that final week, but we started thinking about it from a PR standpoint, and we said, well, we're not going to get a lot of bang for this legislation from a PR standpoint by releasing it now. Why don't we just wait until we return from the August recess? And so that's what we decided. We went on home. One night after the Michael Brown situation in Ferguson had occurred, and I'm sitting down on my couch. I had my proverbial box of popcorn and a Coca-Cola. I'm sitting down watching the news and everything, and I'm eating my popcorn. And lo and behold, I see before my eyes the use of military equipment by the Ferguson Police Department, confronting what appeared to be lawfully acting citizens protesting what they saw as an injustice. And I saw the same gun turret and people looking out of it with their weapons trained on the civilians, and they were in all of this military garb, and they were carrying what appeared to be automatic weapons. I did not know whether or not they were automatic or semi-automatic, but they were certainly military-style weapons. And so we saw what the impact of the legislation that we had already prepared was having, and the rest of the American people saw it as well. And so with that came help from the office of Representative Raul Labrador. Now, we both serve on judiciary, and we've been known to accost each other like pit bulls in the middle of a fighting ring. And that's the way that we go at each other. But on this issue, Mr. Labrador and I came together like close friends. And so together, we made some additions and perfected the legislation. And I appreciate Representative Labrador's office input into that legislation. It made it better. And then together we introduced that legislation when the House returned, and so things have happened, and here we are today. So I'm very happy that you all are here. I want to give my regards to the panel for your great work on this issue, and I'm looking forward to us being able to make a dent in this issue of militarization of police departments across the country. Because many of those same small police departments with part-time law enforcement officers also have SWAT teams. And these SWAT teams have acquired the military-style equipment, and then under the 1033 law, there is a requirement that the recipient of this surplus military equipment actually utilize the equipment within 1 year from the date of receipt. And so that opens up Pandora's box for departments that don't really need the equipment and certainly don't have the personnel who are trained in terms of how to use the equipment, when to use the equipment, where to use it, and then there's a requirement that you actually use it. This is mind-boggling. The ramifications are quite serious, and we see them unfold every day. In Georgia alone, this year, there's been at least one homeowner who hears noises at night. It's a no-knock drug raid, a no-knock search warrant being executed for drugs that happens to be served at the wrong home. And then the homeowner is in the house. Georgia is a pro-gun state. Georgia is a state that likes for you to have guns and wants you to be able to protect yourself inside your home as well as outside of your home. Even in bars and in churches, the law protects you in terms of having a weapon. And so this is a man who's in his home, 59 years old, and no-knock warrant. The wife alerts the husband that I see some folks coming up the driveway with this, I don't know who they are. They got masks on, and they're coming up the driveway, and then he goes to confront the situation, getting ready to come inside his door to protect his wife who's upstairs cowering, and he's got the shotgun, and the folks bust in, and bam, they filled him full of lead. an innocent homeowner just simply trying to defend his property. Another instance where no-knock search warrant, use of flashbang grenades. A little boy, a 1-year-old in a crib in a dark room, and late at night, here comes the drug squad, bust down the door, throw in the flashbang grenade. It happens to land in the crib of the baby and just does a whole lot of damage. The baby has sustained about $800,000-900,000 in medical bills and will have to have surgery each and every year up until age 20 to accommodate for the growth that he's supposed to have, and then all of the facial things and the chest problems that they have to make sure that his body grows as naturally as it can, so that he's going to have surgery. And it was a mistaken, it was a search warrant based on false information. And so law enforcement itching to use the equipment that they acquire under 1033 is a problem. And the problem is growing with the spread of the equipment. $4 billion, I think, worth of military-grade weaponry distributed free of charge to local, state, and some federal law enforcement agencies without any input from the civilian governing authority. You can just petition directly as a law enforcement agency to the Defense Logistical Agency after perusing their website, which lists all of the surplus property. And then if the law enforcement agency decides that it wants that property, then they fill out what is essentially a one-page request form and send it in. It has to go through a state process also, but that state process, at least in Georgia, is pretty perfunctory. And it's just kind of a rubber stamp or just a signature of approval. The law enforcement agency acquires the equipment, and then the local governing authority is on the hook for maintenance and liability. So lots of issues that need to be addressed. We are in the process of making sure that we address all of these issues. And then we have introduced legislation that would actually prohibit the transfer from the military to civilian law enforcement of certain types of military equipment, namely those flashbang grenades, silencers. Can anybody tell me a legitimate reason for law enforcement, domestic law enforcement, to acquire silencers? That's kind of, I've not heard, I'm still waiting to hear a justification for the need for that kind of weaponry. Things like armored helicopters and other aircraft, armored drones, weaponry that is 50 calibers or greater, and then there's some other things that we also are seeking to prohibit the transfer of. And so with that, I will now turn the program back over to Chris, who will take it from here. I appreciate everyone's attendance, and thank you for your support for this bill. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Congressman. I now have the distinct pleasure of introducing our moderator for today's discussion, Kimberly Atkins, who will introduce the rest of our panel. Kim is the chief Washington reporter and columnist for the Boston Herald, where she covers national and political news. She's previously served as the Washington bureau chief for Lawyers Weekly and as a reporter for the Herald, the Journal News, and the Boston Globe. In her previous life, Kim was an attorney in Boston and has argued in a number of trial and appellate level courts, including the First U.S. Circuit Court of Appeals. She received her Bachelor of Arts from Wayne State University, her JD from my alma mater, Boston University School of Law, and a Master's of Science degree in journalism from Columbia University. Please join me in welcoming Kim Atkins.
Thank you so much, and thank you all for being here for this panel discussion of a very important issue, and I thank the Congressman for coming and laying out the issue so well. As we sit here today, tensions in Ferguson, Missouri are again high as everyone awaits the decision as to whether there will be an indictment against Darren Wilson, the officer who was involved in the shooting of Michael Brown. And with that, the world is wondering if the result of that decision will result in more demonstrations, which would again put the protesters against a police force that is armed with military equipment, the same sort of situation that led to the images that we all watched over the summer. But it's also important to know that the militarization of police isn't always that high profile. It isn't always that that grand or that spectacular. It is happening often every day in ways that we don't always hear about, as the Congressman said, and SWAT teams being clad in military gear being dispatched to do things like execute warrants, or the no-knock searches with the use of flash grenades and other things that can really make the police much more like a homegrown army as opposed to a local law enforcement agency. So we're going to talk about a lot of the issues surrounding that with my very esteemed panel of experts. Their full credentials are in your materials. It would take half the day just to list them all, so I'm going to very quickly highlight some of them, but I encourage you to look a little further. Kara Danksy is Senior Counsel at the ACLU's Center for Justice. She's a national criminal justice policy expert, and she oversees the organization's work on police militarization, as well as research and writing on the initiative to end mass incarceration. Before joining the ACLU, she served as senior advisor and special projects lead at the DHS Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties, and as executive director and lecturer in law of the Stanford Criminal Justice Center. We also have Barry Friedman, a professor of law at NYU School of Law. He's a leading authority on constitutional law and the federal courts, and the author of the critically acclaimed The Will of the People: How Public Opinion Has Influenced the Supreme Court and Shaped the Meaning of the Constitution. He's currently writing a book on policing and the Constitution and launching the Policing Project at NYU Law. We also have Ronald Hampton. He is the DC representative of Blacks in Law Enforcement of America. He is the former executive director of the National Black Police Association and a retired 23-year veteran of the DC Metropolitan Police Department. Additionally, he serves as a law enforcement fellow at UDC's Institute for Public Safety and Justice and an expert in community policing and problem-solving training programs. And we also have Tom Nolan, the Associate Professor of Criminology and Director of the Graduate Program in Criminology at Merrimack College. He's a former Senior Policy Analyst in the Office of Civil Rights and Civil Liberties at the Department of Homeland Security here in Washington, as well as a 27-year veteran and former lieutenant of the Boston Police Department. I'm a little biased, go Red Sox. His scholarly publications are in the area of gender roles in policing, the police subculture, and the influence of the popular culture on criminal justice processes. So I would like first for Kara to kick off our discussion to talk a little bit about the history of the militarization of police and also the findings of the ACLU's report, just to give us a background of how this came to be.
Sure, happy to, and thanks for having me. I do want to just start out by emphasizing something that has already been said, but just to make it explicit, we decided to do our investigation into the militarization of policing long before Ferguson happened, and we spent about a year and a half studying different aspects of the militarization of policing across the country. I will describe the findings that we made in the course of our investigation and in this report, War Comes Home, the excessive militarization of American policing. But I did want to also emphasize Ferguson really shined a light on this problem of militarization of policing and brought it to the attention of many Americans, which is a really good thing. And at the same time, those of us who study this issue and people who live in certain communities that have been aggressively and unnecessarily and overly policed for decades know that this is not a new issue. So I wanted to just note that and note that our report came out in June of 2014, about a month and a half before Ferguson. So it's been really interesting, and I'm very happy to see that there are so many members of the public who are interested and who are taking note of this important issue. So in terms of the findings that we made in the course of our investigation, we had two sets of findings, and one set of findings are general findings that we made based on our analysis of existing literature and scholarship. And then the other set of findings was based on a statistical analysis that we did of 800 SWAT raids that occurred across the country during the years 2011 and 2012. So the two more general findings that we made based on existing literature are, one, that policing in America has in fact become excessively militarized. And what we mean when we say that is that policing in America today tends to be characterized by militarism in the areas of equipment, tactics, and culture, which is not to say that all police departments are militarized or that all police officers view themselves as soldiers, but it is to say that we see a systemic trend across the country in which the police are using military weapons, tactics and culture in a way that is harmful. And I say that because I think often the conversation about militarized policing focuses on the equipment. And I think that that's really important because we have to talk about the equipment, but I think that there are some other aspects too that get more at the level of tactics and culture. The other thing about that first finding, that policing in America has become excessively militarized, is that we found that the militarization of policing at the local level has been fueled, at least in part, by three federal programs. The Defense Department's 1033 program, which Mr. Johnson spoke about, the Department of Justice's Burn JAG program, which has been in existence since the 1980s and has resulted in the funneling of billions of dollars to state and local law enforcement, and the DHS Homeland Security Grant Program that has existed since around 2002 with the creation of the Department of Homeland Security, much of which goes to state and local law enforcement. So our second general finding is that the militarization of policing, which has occurred over time, has occurred with essentially no public oversight. So we ended up collecting thousands of documents related to this issue, and one of the things we learned is that there is really no standard regarding data collection at the local level. So police departments are really on their own in terms of how much data they collect, what types of data they collect, and how they record the information. There are really no standards about that across the country. And furthermore, there's really almost no reporting on police tactics, including what we would consider unnecessarily militarized policing tactics. There's very little reporting at the local level. There's very little reporting at the state level, with a few exceptions. And there's almost no reporting at the federal level. So it's really difficult, in a sense, to get a handle on how militarized police have become. But nonetheless, we do think that this has occurred with almost no public oversight, and that that's a really important area for reform. And then we made three more specific findings based on our analysis of the 800 SWAT raids that we looked at. One is that, contrary to what many of us may assume, the overwhelming majority of SWAT raids that we looked at over the course of those 2 years were not for emergency situations, did not appear to be needed to save someone's life or to interrupt an emergency threatening situation, but rather to serve a search warrant on a person's home more often than not to search for drugs. So what we found is of the 800 SWAT raids we looked at, a full 79% were for the purpose of serving a search warrant. And it's just important to note that when the police are serving a search warrant, all they really have is probable cause to believe that there's a crime or that there's contraband that's likely to be found in the home. There's no charge that's been brought, there's no conviction, there's no perpetrator, there's not even a crime necessarily that you can say that has been committed. The police have probable cause to believe that there's a crime, and therefore what they are conducting is a domestic law enforcement investigation. And in many of the cases that we looked at, they were conducting domestic law enforcement investigations using paramilitary weapons and tactics. The second finding that we found based on those 800 SWAT raids that we looked at is that people of color were disproportionately likely to be impacted by those SWAT raids than white people, and that disparity grew when you looked at SWAT raids for drug searches as opposed to SWAT raids for other kinds of searches. So, for example, as I mentioned, 79% were for search warrant execution on people's homes. The disparity in terms of race grew when looking just at that subset of paramilitary raids. And when we looked at what turned out to be 7% of the SWAT raids that we analyzed being for real emergency situations like barricade or active shooter scenarios, the disparity was less. And so the people that the police were looking for more often were white in those circumstances. And then the third finding that we found based on our analysis of those 800 SWAT raids is that the unnecessary use of violent tactics and equipment, including armored personnel carriers, was used in a large majority of those SWAT raids, and further, that the unnecessary use of violent tactics and equipment, including armored personnel carriers, tended to escalate the risk of bodily harm and property damage, which is important because often we hear the argument that the police need to have these equipment and these tactics available for public safety purposes. But actually, when these kinds of equipment and tactics are used unnecessarily, it actually tends to escalate the risk of violence. So that's what I wanted to say about the findings contained in our report, and I think I'd like to talk about our recommendations for reform because I do think that there are a number of things that can be done at the local, state, and federal levels. Should I do that now, or should we table that for discussion?
We're going to talk about solutions a little bit later.
Okay,
so
great.
I think that maybe that'll be a good time
Perfect.
to talk about that. Now, I would love to hear Barry talk a little bit about accountability. We heard the congressman say that in a lot of times there's no oversight by local officials over these programs, but it's clear that someone needs to be in charge here. How is it playing out on the ground, and how is that one of the problems?
Thanks. So this is one of those situations where I'd like to say that I'm happy to be here, but I'm not. And even though it's good to get to talk to you and it's good to be back in my hometown, just listening to the congressman talk about these stories, and you all should read the ACLU report if you haven't, but you read sort of one after another and they break your heart. Kara's told us about the problem, and I do want to just do a bit of diagnosis. And what I'm going to suggest, I've come to realize, is going to seem to you both ridiculously familiar, obvious, and yet at the same time extremely alien. It's a general view about policing, and then I want to just say something about why it's hard particularly to apply it to the 1033 program, why the 1033 program is particularly tricky. So, I want to start by making an obvious point, which is that we're here talking about militarization and SWAT teams, but we could be talking about a host of problems involving policing. I mean, it could be drones, it could be stop and frisk, it could be NSA surveillance, it could be drug interdiction by the DEA or state and local police. And we tend to see each of those as an individual problem that we got to sort of figure out how to solve, and not to see the overarching problem that has to do with all of them, which is this astonishing to me as a constitutional law person, failure of democratic accountability. So when things go wrong, and they went wrong in Ferguson, we tend to blame the police and policing. But what I want to tell us is we should be blaming us. We're the ones responsible. The police are paid by us. They work for us. We tell them what to do, or we fail to tell them what to do. And that's where the problem rests. So this is an odd room to state something as obvious as I'm about to state it, but you all know how government is supposed to work. Legislatures are supposed to make rules, and they often delegate authority to agencies, and those agencies then themselves have to make rules, which are subjected to public notice and scrutiny and transparency, and that's how we form the law that governs all of us every day. Well, the police are an agency just like any other part of government. In fact, at some level, they're most significant part of government as an agency, certainly the most threatening, as we saw in Ferguson, and yet none of those rules apply to the police. The delegation of authority is extraordinarily broad. It's usually just to say, here's the criminal law, enforce it. There's some internal police regulations, but none of the sort of notice and comment rulemaking that's familiar to all of you, none of it exists. And to me, it's just an astonishing thing, and that's where the problem with lots of policing rests. Now, that's a general thought about policing, but there's a particular problem with the 1033 program, which is at least trying to think about, because it's the nut that has to get cracked, which is that 1033 is a handout, like many of the programs that Kara talked about. It's, this is the government just giving material right to the police forces. And it's interesting, if you focus on conditions on federal spending grants generally, often they're thought to be too onerous, but this is one of those programs where, if anything is true, they're not onerous enough. So, Congress has this very broad delegation, and the equipment is just available to the forces. And what I want to do is I just want to tell you something about the aftermath of Ferguson that I found fascinating when I started to look around on the Google and see what had happened, which is the reaction that many communities had once their eyes were open to it, once the lawmaking bodies and communities started to pay attention. So in Woodstock, New York, the town board passed a resolution that said, the Woodstock Town Board declares it has never accepted nor will accept or procure military arms and or heavy armor for its police department now or in the future. The Woodstock police are trained to act in a rational, non-military, non-abusive way. In New Hampshire, a bill was introduced in the state legislature to ban municipalities from accepting military vehicles without voter approval, which happened because the Concord City Council had decided to accept a federal grant to buy a Bearcat, despite the fact that some 1,500 citizens had signed a petition saying, we don't want you to do this. So the LA Unified School District decided to return 3 grenade launchers. Yes, that's grenade launchers. The Aledo, Texas district decided to return its M14 and M16 rifles. The San Diego Unified School District was returning its MRAP. The school superintendent said, look, if any part of our community is not comfortable with it, we can't be comfortable with it. And the chief of police said, of the school district police said that, whatever value he got out of the equipment could not exceed in value the public trust. So MRAPs, these armored vehicles, are a particularly fascinating case. They seem to have become a flashpoint, I guess, because of their appearance on television, and a lot of people, like the congressman, saying, whoa, where did this come from? So San Jose, California, their police department decided to return their MRAP, talking about problems with the image of the community. Davis, California, the city council voted to return its MRAP. In Sangamon County, Illinois, it was a big issue in a sheriff's race between a Democrat who wanted to return the MRAP and a Republican who didn't. The Republican won for whatever reasons, including maybe that, but I'd want to say that's fine. That's how democracy is supposed to work, which is that we have a debate about things and reach decisions. But one of the most interesting things I read was from the UT, the University of Texas Police Force, which serves 300,000 people. And the head of that force made a very convincing argument for keeping the MRAP, which is that he said, look, there's no military munitions associated with this vehicle. It's used solely to get police safely to an incident and to get victims away. Again, it's a reasonable argument to talk about. It might be too expensive a tow truck or too expensive for those purposes, but it's an argument. But then listen to what he had to say, because this is exactly what I think gets lost in this entire debate. He said, the question communities need to ask is, how are their police agencies going to use this equipment? And if there's been a deliberative, thoughtful, rational process. I think that there's where the judgment should be made, not simply the fact that the agency has received a certain piece of equipment and decided to take it. So the point I'll leave you with, and then I have things to say about solutions also, though probably not as many as Kara, is, it's interesting to see what happens when policing gets taken off of this path of not being subjected to democratic accountability, when the spotlight shines, when people make democratic decisions in the usual way, and the outcomes are very different than what happens when the police sort of make the decisions by themselves. And I'll just close by saying, not their fault, it's ours for not intervening.
So one of the points that Kara brought up is the disproportionate impact of police militarization equipment and tactics on communities of color, and race is an issue, just as in the Ferguson case, that all often go hand in hand with this issue. And I would like for Ron to talk a little bit about the issue of race and how and the impact on communities of color.
Yeah, thank you very much, and thank you very much for inviting me to participate in this. I served as a police officer here in Washington, D.C. for a little over 23 years, and race was always an issue. Of course, the police department never acknowledged that race was an issue, but race was an issue in deployment of officers. I was on the police force from 1970 to 1994, and I know there was a time when we didn't have any African-American police officers assigned to the 2nd District. If we go back in history on the police department, it was in 1969 in this city and most cities where they integrated police cars. Blacks and whites officers couldn't ride together. They were not allowed to work together. Blacks were relegated to walking footbeats, and they walked footbeats in white areas, in black areas, not in white areas. But if we go back a little further to 1961, black police officers weren't allowed to arrest white people in most places in America. And we saw the changes in that, but that was logical because African Americans were inferior to whites, so they couldn't arrest a person and read them you couldn't arrest a white person and read them their rights at that time because blacks didn't have the right to do that. So race has always played an issue in policing. In a city like Washington, D.C., looking at, say, for example, juvenile behavior in Washington, D.C., believe it or not, we have never, ever had in our juvenile detention facility or in what used to be Oak Hill is now New Beginnings, we have never detained a white youth in the history of our system. And yet, white youth are involved in committing certain kind of crimes, but they're handled very differently. So race has always been an issue. When we talk about how the police department handled those issues, there was always an acknowledgement that the acknowledgement was that we police all communities the same, that those were not issues. But I wanted to sort of, in the same conversation, but also talk a little bit about how the militarization of the police department affected. We've seen it coming, sort of in the form of how the drug war was carried out in our city. I happened to work in the 3rd District, which is Northwest Washington, and at that time, 7th Street and U Street was a place where people sold drugs as well as people could buy drugs. Now, and I've always maintained that there was just as much drugs being sold in Georgetown as it was in Northwest Washington. But the fact of the matter was that you didn't see jump out police officers. You didn't see the kind of raids taking place in Georgetown that we saw on 7th Street and U Street. We didn't see them spread eagling people in the middle of the street and dragging them out of cars. We didn't see those kind of things take place in Georgetown or upper Northwest. So there's always been a race issue that's involved. But we begin to see, we saw military equipment in Washington, D.C. after Vietnam. After the Vietnam War was over in '72 and the de-escalation of it, we began to see military equipment here then. And as the justification was that the district hosted a lot of demonstrations and things, so the police department had that equipment and utilized it and thought that it was better to have it and not use it than to need it and to not use it, which is a crazy rationale for it in the first place because they didn't have there wasn't a real use for it at that time on the police department. But as from an observation standpoint, I've seen the police department change in terms of the militarization of it and the culture. And if you would just, I maintain that all of this even started more. Police officers have always wanted to be associated with the military, I believe, because as we talked about policing as a service, they sort of got away from that. And the more exciting component of it was running up and down the street with your sirens on and all that kind of stuff. Mm. But the fact of the matter is that it's a public service. But after 9/11, that gave policing leadership in this country the opportunity to be what it always wanted to be, and that was military-like. And we not only see it in how they act and talk, but after 9/11, we saw it in their uniform. Police officers and the leadership went to wearing 4 stars rather than a chief of police badge or chief of police insignia. They wear 4 stars. They wear pocket fatigue pants. You know, we call them in the Air Force utility clothes. but they wear utility clothes. They don't wear slacks and a shirt. They wear utility clothes. So not only do they think like they're in the military, act like they're in the military, now they dress like they're in the military. So consequently, at the end of the day, they're going to behave like they're in the military, and that's going to permeate all their actions. And it has, because that's how they go about doing their job as police officers. Yet we know that the job of being a police officer is to protect and serve. But we don't see protect and serve in our community. And even in this militarization environment, that only takes place in the black and brown and poor community. That's not taking place in Georgetown or upper Northwest or in Manhattan, New York City. Those kind of things aren't taking place because they're still invested in protection and serving that community, because the questions are being asked, the conversations are taking place about the police strategy and what you're going to do, and if this happens, what are you going to do? But that conversation doesn't take place in our community, and that's not new. That has been the case all along. So that conversation needs to take place in our community. We need to be invested in that process. Thank you.
Thank you, thank you. And that leads us to another issue. Speaking of having conversations taking place, there's the culture within police departments and the relationship between police and the community that is sort of underlying all of this. And how can you can there be a solution without addressing that? I just can speak, I live in Northern Virginia, and I was heading out on an errand yesterday, and there was someone who was pulled over, and 2 white police officers were searching the car as 2 black men stood nearby and watched, and there was a couple that was standing there and watching, and as I passed them by, they said to me, "We're standing here so that we make sure that nobody gets shot." That's the community, and that's the perception of police culture, and then you have police on the other side. That's the community that they're policing. So how do we begin to address that, Tom?
I thought about Ronald's point and the deployment of SWAT teams strictly in communities of color. And I go back to my experience as a Boston police officer, and I was on the first SWAT team in 1979, and the first active deployments of SWAT, and both of those 2 times SWAT teams were deployed in 1979, and at the time, this was an extremely rare occurrence. It was an anomaly, and I think not coincidentally, after hearing Ronald's comment, was that both of these deployments were in communities of color. And at the time, this was something that was so rare and so infrequent that it would be the lead, and was the lead story on the 6 o'clock news. It would be on the front page of the newspaper that there was a SWAT deployment in this area. And in fact, I remember discharging a tear gas weapon into a home. But in those situations, they weren't the execution of drug warrants. These were barricaded suspects. In fact, in one of them, the suspect had barricaded himself in a home and had shot in the chest the second highest ranking superintendent-in-chief of the Boston Police Department at the time. I say that in moving forward to community policing principles that we embraced in the late 1980s and early 1990s, endorsed and privileged very strong connection with communities and partnerships to solve problems and prevention. And I remember it being drilled into me as a police officer, as a sergeant, and then a lieutenant: partnership, problem solving, prevention, the 3 Ps. And this was something that we were trained very heavily in, forming alliances with the communities that we policed, going out and meeting people in the communities and forging relationships that you didn't see, for example, present in Ferguson, Missouri. But those relationships we did forge. And then in the early 2000s, particularly after 9/11, we saw a paradigm shift from community policing and problem-oriented principles to the war on terror, and we became Homeland Security Police. And we're the Homeland Security Police now. And I think what has happened as a direct result of that is that those relationships that we forged and worked so hard to attain and to maintain in the late 1980s and early 1990s began to erode, because the police were seen, particularly in communities of color, as an army of occupation. If you dress police officers up as soldiers and you put them in military vehicles and you give them military weapons, they adopt a warrior mentality. and we fight wars against enemies. And the enemies are the people who live in our cities, particularly in communities of color. So what we see now, and I live in a community, in a neighborhood in Boston that's the most diverse neighborhood in the city. And I walk my dog in the park, and I see the police conducting themselves in a highly militaristic fashion on routine patrol activities. And I know that's what they're doing because I come from that world. What I experience and what people in the street experience is a palpable, tangible sense of fear. And that is that we are unsafe. If the police need semi-automatic rifles to protect us and to keep us safe, I can infer that we are in fact not safe, that we are in danger, and that we are always and already at peril. And I think that's the unfortunate result of our failing to object if we knew that the police were engaging in this militaristic activity in the acquisition of these weapons. We weren't included in the discussion. We didn't know anything about it, and I think Ferguson, as Kara brought up, brought that into the glare of the public spotlight. And I think certainly my experience in the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing, which is a very touchy subject for Bostonians and people who come from Boston. But what we saw in that aftermath was the unilateral suspension of the United States Constitution, and particularly the Fourth Amendment. And we saw, for the first time that I recall in the United States of America, house-to-house searches. And what I said to some colleagues of mine who work in the news media, that when we fail to object to what's going on now, and we did, we forfeit our right to do so in the future, and we have. So I think it's important that we have this discussion here today, and I celebrate the fact that the Congressman has brought us together to discuss these very important issues.
Thank you, Tom, and you're anticipating one of my next question, and I was going to use the aftermath of the Boston Marathon bombing as an example, because yes, there was this unprecedented shelter-in-place order and the door-to-door searches that you talked about as when the two suspects were at large. But on the other hand, I have people say to me, look, you had two suspects who were in a residential neighborhood waging a war. They were using explosive devices and grenades at police, and if there ever were an instance where military equipment and tactics were called for, that was it. So how do you balance the interests of the Constitution and the interest of keeping not only communities safe, but police officers safe against one another? Is there a balance to be struck here? You can start, anyone can jump in.
Well, I think the balance is that, and this has yet to occur, that there has been no public accountability for anyone in law enforcement decision-making authority at the state, local, or federal level in the aftermath of that marathon bombing. And I think it's important to point out that how the Tsarnaev brothers, the remaining Tsarnaev brother was apprehended was through a traditional 911 call where an individual saw something in his backyard, the tarp on his boat was flapping in the breeze, and he thought he saw a hand, and he went in and he called 911, and the police came out and they shot the boat full of 200 holes. And as we now know, and I don't know that the police believed any differently at the time, but that Tsarnaev brother was unarmed. So the house-to-house searches and that militaristic, that highly militaristic response, at the time we perhaps thought that this was warranted. It was violative of the Constitution. We failed to object, and what we had a year later was a revisiting of that suspension of the Constitution, where the marathon finish line, and for, I believe, 8 blocks in any direction, anyone who was walking on the street was subjected to a police search without a warrant. So,
I think that has created, it creates a dilemma, and one that prevents a conversation from taking place. And this is the example. That behavior, Tom, takes place every day in our community. The war on drugs was a perfect example of that. When crime occurred, they thought it was, or would say that it was drug-related, and they would search every house if they was looking for individuals. They even convinced community and residents to report people who were standing out on the corner, and for the life of me, you can't tell if a person is selling drugs or smoking marijuana when you're 7 or 8 houses away from a person standing on the corner. But the mere fact that it was being said that it was drugs and marijuana, heroin, and the behavior justified the police going in and searching 7 or 8 houses. And we actually had citizens who had been convinced that they would cooperate with the police by allowing the police to violate their Fourth Amendment right and other rights going along with that. Now, we see that community sees that every day, but they don't see it every day on the other side of town. So when it happens on the other side of town, the response from that community is well, they must have had the issue that justified that behavior to take place. But the fact of the matter is that when you compare numerically the incidents, there'd probably be 100 in our community and 1 in Georgetown, for example, and there's no comparison at all. And when you look at why they used that strategy, it didn't have anything to do with why they used it in our community on a regular basis. So sometimes the rebuttal get muted because we've come to, in our community, we've come to expect this as really typical police service, and somehow or another, in order for us to have good police service, we got to accept all of this, and that's unacceptable.
Can I just say something about the word balance, because it always comes up, and there's always this balance that we have to have between our, security and our liberty. And then, what happens is liberty loses, because you read Supreme Court decisions, and the interest in preventing terrorism is so grave, and we always focus on the big thing, terrorism or drugs, and then, an individual's being asked to do a very little thing, to be subjected to some kind of intrusion, pee in a bottle, a search, and so there's this huge problem and this little intrusion, and so people, who are concerned about this often want to even walk away from the balancing language. But at some level, you could embrace it. You could just embrace it a different way. So, if we were here talking about the EPA, about environmental issues, there'd be lots of talk of cost-benefit analysis. And it would be really rigorous. And people would be working really hard to identify the harm that chemicals cause and the value of a life. None of that exists in policing. It is absolutely astonishing. Like, we talk about the balance, but Kara said it, and it's useful. They did a wonderful thing, actually getting documents and trying to have some sense of the data, which is, what do the data tell us? What do the data tell us about the efficacy of what the police are doing? Is it making sense? Drug interdiction efforts. You look at drug interdiction, which is one of my pet peeves, because it's very difficult to get information on hit rates, on how often in drug interdiction efforts, they actually find somebody who's got drugs. But when you start to hear the numbers, they're astonishing. The rare instance when defense counsel says, things to ask the officer on the stand, how often did you do this? And how often did you find somebody? It turns out, well, I searched 600 people and found 10. We wouldn't, if you were going to balance those kind of things, the balances would come out very, very differently. And so I think we have to look at data and collect it and start to ask what works and what's the cost of doing it that way.
There's a lot of talk about rights and liberties, and I know a lot of people would probably think, well, there's a such thing called the Fourth Amendment, and how do these things exist under the Constitution? How does that jibe? Like, where do we take that? Where does the Fourth Amendment play a role here? Anyone?
Well, let me say this. One of the things that happens in our community is that we have these at dinner time talk with our children about how to survive, particularly the African-American men, about how to survive police-citizen contact on the street, whether it's walking, riding, or flying. And it always comes down to we should educate them about how to protect their right. But first of all, we have to tell them that they have one, because most of them don't know that they have one. And you don't have one if you don't claim it. So you have to say that at first. I have a Fourth Amendment right of protection against unreasonable searches and seizure. If you say that to some police officers, then you're going to really get searched. So now, so now, what do you do after that happens? The conversation sort of gathers around the idea of really just paying attention mentally and other things to what takes place. But you can't win with the police on the street, because even when they right, even when they wrong, they right, and you can be right and wrong and dead. So you don't want to take that, but we have to have that conversation about how to survive those citizen police contacts. But the police have I believe, and I've witnessed it, they have abused it because there's this notion about, we hear the police use a lot of time, if you haven't done anything wrong, you don't have anything to worry about. And when you go back and look at all of those cases that we've seen for years now, most of them, people didn't do anything wrong, and they didn't end up having nothing to worry about. They had a whole lot to worry about, and some of them even lost their life as a result of that. But the conversation, we have to have the conversation about, with our young people, about those kind of things. Here in the district, there's a project of young people who, some years ago, was able to have a meeting with some police officers, sit down and talk about what was happening to them. The police officers didn't believe the students. There was a young woman in the group where police officer did believe them and was willing to work with the students to sort of see what was happening. So they waited one evening and watched some students leave the school and watched how the police almost abducted them, accosted them, searched their backpack, went through their pockets and all these kinds of things. And then they had a later meeting, and because the officer spoke up about the treatment that went down, then the police department was willing to do something about it and to really work with the young people. Now, the young people were the winners in all of this. They was able to develop a brochure and hand it out and have conversations in schools about these kind of things. And it's basically about the Fourth Amendment in terms of what do you do when you get stopped and an awful lot of things like that. But I don't know, other than the conversation, the education and things that's going on about it, and that's very important, but when we look at the courts and how the courts address this issue, the police are given more and more and more and more privileges when we talk about these things because, again, this weight, this balance about what's important and what isn't important and what that important issue is, and now it's always matched against something that's very small. And so citizens say, well, you know, I'm a law-abiding citizen, you know, that's what I ought to do.
Should I say something about that? So just a couple things I would say about the Fourth Amendment. One is an anecdote about a town called Paragould, Arkansas, which is a small town in Arkansas, and about a year to a year and a half ago, the police chief announced in a town hall meeting that there was going to be a new approach to patrol policing in certain neighborhoods, certain high-crime neighborhoods, that starting then, at that time, the police would be patrolling particular neighborhoods carrying AR-15s and would be instructed to stop anyone for any reason or for no reason at all, and to arrest anyone who refused to answer questions or provide identification. Announced this at a town hall meeting, was then advised that said procedures almost certainly would have violated the Fourth Amendment, and then decided to roll back the program, kept the AR-15s, but at least rolled back the instruction to the patrol officers to stop anyone for any reason or no reason at all and arrest people who refused to provide identification and answer questions. So I say that to say that it's really important that the police be reminded of the importance of the Fourth Amendment on a regular basis when these kinds of practices are announced. The other thing I guess I would just say, because our study focused on SWAT raids, often involving SWAT raids of homes for execution of search warrants, is that the courts have held, as Ron said, the courts have held that when the police go to a home to serve a search warrant, often they can get something called a no-knock warrant, which many people have heard of, which authorizes them to raid the home without knocking and announcing. But even if they don't have a no-knock warrant, the standards are fairly loose in terms of the police's ability to forcibly enter a home even after knocking and announcing. It's not entirely, they're not required to wait a very long period of time before forcing their way into a home after knocking and announcing their presence. And the court has held further that if the police do violate their obligation to knock and announce their presence, any evidence that is obtained in the course of that search does not have to be excluded from trial. So the police can violate their obligation to knock and announce their presence, forcibly enter a home, seize evidence, and then use that evidence at trial against a person who might be charged going forward. So that's what the courts have held, and the reason that I say that is that historically, the exclusionary rule is a rule that says that if police violate somebody's rights, the evidence has to be excluded from trial, and that's an important check. It's an important deterrent on the police to violate people's rights, and that deterrent is missing in many of these cases.
Sure, yeah.
Just, so the courts are terrible. I mean, we might as well all just admit it, because it needs to be said, and it's disappointing to me. I mean, I grew up and wanted to become a lawyer and became a lawyer and thought that's where you would go. And they have completely let us all down in this area. They have just abdicated. I mean, 10 seconds of history is that by the late 1960s, the country knew that there were issues about policing, about communities of color. We all know the sort of historical events. The Warren Court steps in aggressively, and everybody kind of mops their brow and says, thank God we don't have to deal with that problem. But then Richard Nixon runs against the Warren Court. The court turns conservative, and though they are mixed on all kinds of issues, on law enforcement issues, on Fourth Amendment issues, the courts are just one-sided and bad. And the moral of that story is to stop thinking about the courts as a place that are going to be helpful in any way, and that's why the conversation has to happen in legislative bodies, because we do have important rights. I mean, I listened to Tom and I'm moved by it because I believe in these rights deeply, but they're not, to think that they're going to get protected in some way other than if people step up to say these are the way we're going to protect them is dreaming.
I want to be clear that we're going to leave plenty of time for questions, that we'll open up to questions from you all very soon. So while you're thinking about all the things you want to ask this great panel of experts, I do want to turn the discussion to, I'm sorry.
I just wanted to acquaint people who probably don't know this, but how in the world of policing the Constitution is viewed. And the police, in their subculture, view the Constitution as a hindrance, and they view it as something to be run around, and they view it as something that is there. They acknowledge it exists, and in fact, they swear an oath to uphold it. But in the subculture, it's viewed as something to be held in a degree of disdain. And it's something that exists out there, but we'll figure a way to get around it. And part of my function as a police manager, a sergeant and lieutenant, was when the police officers in the street did what they did that was oftentimes violative of constitutional principles, it was my job to extricate them from the predicament that they had found themselves in. So that's how the police, and unless we embark on a cultural sea change, I'm afraid that that's something that we're going to have to contend with.
So that brings us to solutions to this. Beyond, we have legislative solutions. Legislation won't change the culture of police officers. It won't change the perception in the communities. So what are some of the solutions to this issue? Do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, I guess I would just say very briefly, I think that there are solutions at all levels of government. At the local level, I think it's really important that city councils and other local bodies hold public hearings when the police want to obtain federal equipment from the Defense Department or money from the Departments of Justice or Homeland Security that they would then use to purchase military equipment. The example of Concord, New Hampshire was very interesting. That was one of the few examples I'm aware of where there was a city council hearing on the police department's proposal to obtain a $300,000 grant from DHS and use that money to buy an armored personnel carrier. One of the individuals who testified at that city council hearing was a retired Marine who had come back from Iraq and said, please do not do this to our communities. I have seen combat, I have seen battle, and I don't want to see it on the streets of Concord. And then Concord proceeded to buy the Bearcat. So I think that there can be hearings at the local level. I also think that there's a lot of work to be done at the state level. Last session, the state of Utah passed two really important bills. One requires reporting of all SWAT raids that occur throughout the state annually to the state legislature, and then the state government will then make that information available to the public. I think this is a critical first step. Maryland did something similar between the years of 2010 and 2013, but that law is no longer on the books. It's a critical first step because it's a first step in figuring out exactly how pervasive the problem of militarization of law enforcement is. And I also think that there's work that states can be doing to impose some reasonable standards and reasonable restraints on the ability of police departments to deploy SWAT teams. And then at the federal level, we're very encouraged about Mr. Johnson's bill. We're encouraged about the fact that the president has called for a review of these 3 federal programs that fuel the militarization of policing. And so there's definitely work that Congress can be doing, certainly to rein in some of these federal programs and require more reporting. The other thing I just wanted to say about solutions is that I think that this problem is systemic. And on the issue specifically of training, we've heard a lot, certainly in the wake of Ferguson, of the importance of ensuring that if the police are going to have access to military weapons and tactics, that they be properly trained. And that's certainly a key piece of reform. But I would be very disappointed if the momentum that currently exists to bring reform to this problem stopped with better police training of equipment that we probably don't want them to have. This is a pervasive problem that, again, it touches on the equipment, the tactics, but it also touches on the culture of militarism that I'm afraid is pervading police across the country. And so we need to be thinking of reform as systemic, not as addressing just a few examples.
I just want to state a problem, because I don't have a solution, but I think it's the right problem, which is, so I do think the courts are awful, and I do think that the answer rests in legislative bodies and in more accountable democracy and people in communities making decisions about what policing should look like. But it's a problem in, sort of legal theory we call a public choice theory, but all of you who work in legislatures understand it as an election problem, which is, it's great to talk about legislative reform, and the question is how to make it happen. So yes, when everybody is treated to watching national television and watching armored vehicles and people with rifles facing American citizens, they are aghast, and they will be aghast for a short period of time, and they will go back to their happy lives and forget that it happened. And if you are a legislator, you don't have much of an incentive to do something about policing issues. There are no win issues. I mean, I'm happy to hear if I'm wrong about that, but very often the weight of authority is prosecutors and the police, and the people that are affected by policing they're not organized in groups, they don't have a voice. And then the other thing that happens is that if you, start to regulate the police and something goes wrong, you're the person that fingers are going to get pointed at. And so one of the most interesting and hardest challenges for me is to think, how do you motivate legislative bodies to do things about problems that they would actually rather not look at? Now, one answer, which Kara points to, is, you get people to do things that aren't that controversial, even though it was shocking because the Maryland bill about the SWAT teams was hugely controversial and is no longer on the books. But I do think information laws that force information to be revealed, to be kept, or at least one way to start because they're somewhat less controversial, but still, I just see that as a big problem, and I don't have a good solution.
Anyone else?
I think hand in hand with laws that demand accountability and documentation in, for example, SWAT deployments, there needs to be the tone set from the top down in police organizations. And some police executives have been extremely successful in this, and that is in this organization that the use of excessive force, for example, will not be tolerated, that violations of policies and procedures will result in disciplinary sanctions. I know that, and I think Ronald will agree with me on this, that in the bad old days and generations past, that police use of excessive force was an extremely pertinent, relevant issue. It was something that was pervasive, that police, particularly in certain communities, would resort to the use of excessive force indiscriminately. And I think that through the disciplinary process and holding officers accountable and setting a tone from the top down in organizations and meting out hefty disciplinary sanctions against police officers who violated policies and procedures with respect to excessive force, that has resulted in I'm going to suggest, a significant lowering in the incidence of excessive force. It hasn't disappeared entirely, but I think that model is transportable and can be used to regulate the instances where militarized weapons and SWAT deployments are violating protocol, and the protocol needs to be established, as Kara has said, there needs to be an established procedure that's set, and it needs to be regulated through legislation and monitored, and I think then you will begin. Police understand discipline and they understand punishment. It's part of their culture as well. So I think that once you see those kinds of the impositions of punishments, that the culture will change. That's how the culture changes in policing.
Oh, no, I would agree with Tom. That is the case, and primarily a lot of that reform came from within. Some of it as a result of advocacy organizations like Hispanic, Black police organizations raising those issues, because we witnessed those kind of things, and in some cases interceded in it in terms of. So they had to either deal with us or them in that relationship in terms of what happened. I'm not for training myself, because training is only going to train them how to do it, and then more importantly how to do it and then get away with it at the end of the day, because that's what training does sometimes. Education is something that we haven't really looked at when we talk about policing, arming police officers with options and alternatives and different things other than, because you got to break that culture, and the way you break the culture is give them a new paradigm to work with and work in. The equipment part, I think we can, if we look at some of the other police departments around the world who, and this is crazy to talk about in the U.S., but I've worked with guys in the UK and some of the other countries where they didn't have guns and firearms wasn't as available. And it really works. And they have a great respect, not only for the law, but for the people who carry out the law. And if we could somehow never have a pilot of doing some work like that, but on the other side of it, you got to be willing to invest in the community and that whole model about doing it. And then most of all, I think the solutions lie in our communities, in the neighborhoods, and people are going to have to speak up. They're going to have to demand that their voice be heard and be a part of the process to develop these strategies. And that's why I was hopeful in the mid-'80s when they talked about community policing, because it was a logical position, a logical thing for communities to do. And we've seen so many examples of it working, but people wasn't invested in the amount of time that it was going to take to really implement community policing in the kind of way that it was going to benefit everybody, not just the newspaper or the politicians, but most of all the people who the police served every day. And then lastly, there are some models in the country where people are working in cooperation in a given community with, for the lack of a better term, backing the police out of their community. Now that sounds crazy, but what they're doing is taking more control over the issues that affect people's lives day to day, because sometimes we know that, for example, the Black and brown poor community call the police more than the well-to-do community. And that's because we have less control sometimes over the issues that impact our life every day. So if we can build the structure and capacity to deal with those issues, backing the police away, then we can call the police when we really need them, and then, you know, they won't come in and jerk us all around because we're in control of those kind of things that's going on. But that takes time, education, not just for the police, but most of all for the citizens and people who live in those communities, and understanding how to use their power and the access that they're going to have to get it done. There's some successful models in utilizing restorative justice tactics or components in doing those kind of things to get it done. That's a long-term investment, but in some ways, I think we need to talk about and think about those alternatives for our community.
Sure. So if anybody has questions, we'd be happy to take them. We just ask that you wait until you get the microphone passed to you. You, sir, just wait for the microphone.
Hi, my name's Dave Price. Thank you for the panel. I spent all my life in two jobs, journalism and education, all in urban areas. And I'd love to sit here and argue with anything that you've said, but everything that you said is true. So we can't do that. The point becomes that we really do have two worlds, and I had a chance to work in one and go home to the other. But the one question that I really don't understand, and maybe could address it, even though it should maybe be coming from someone else. The weapons are not, they're coming down, okay? They're unused, I assume, and they're coming down to a force. So there's no money exchanging hands at this point, is that correct? So are they being purchased Or it's a gift?
No, they're surplus,
That's surplus.
that already exists.
So
yeah.
I guess my question is this, you know, if you want to halt it, doesn't the beginning of that halting come from giving them down? If they're not received, they can't use them. It's sort of like, you know, Field of Dreams. Build it and they will come. Don't give it to them, they can't use it. So the question is, where is the emphasis coming from to give these weapons? I understand receiving them, I understand the military culture, you know, those types of things. Where did this start? I mean, somebody said it was a good idea, but does anyone know, I know this is not the group to answer that, does anyone know where that rationale came from? Let's give these out. It's almost as if there was a plan. We're not looking for conspiracies here, but where did this come from? Okay, you know, and if it came from somewhere, isn't that the place where we could go to stop it?
Kara, can you
Yeah,
speak on that?
it came from Congress in 1997, when Congress instructed or authorized the Defense Department to give military equipment away to local law enforcement free of charge, and to give preferences to local law enforcement agencies that intended to use the equipment to do counter-drug work. It was very clearly, in my opinion, part and parcel of the war on drugs, which, you know, had been announced initially in the 70s and then really ramped up in the 80s and then went up full speed ahead in the 1990s. So this is very much born of the intention to arm local police officers with military equipment for the purpose of waging the war on drugs.
Just wait for the microphone.
So then if anyone would acknowledge that the war of drugs was lost, there'd be no need? I mean, is that really, could we do that? I don't mean, can you do that if it comes out of that?
Well, the rationale has evolved over time too, especially with the onset of post 9/11 and the threat of terrorism, correct?
Yeah, the police are now the front lines on the war on terror, so we have simply replaced one war with another war.
Hi, my name's Jessica Sheeter. I work for the Center for Effective Government. I just wanted to say to Tom and Ron, I know I do a lot of work on tax havens and transparency that way. Some of the most effective allies that we have are actually retired policemen or those who've worked in public service but then retired. What are there organizations working on this issue that are themselves policemen or were policemen? And even outside, I know, Ron, you mentioned the African American community as well as the Latino community, but more broadly and nationally coordinated, because I think in order to influence Congress to, for example, address the 1033 issue, which is immense, you do need, I mean, as well as advocacy communities, which I'm a part of, you do also need the voices themselves. I think you both were incredibly articulate this afternoon.
Well, believe it or not, the ACLU, the Center for Constitutional Rights in New York, a variety of organizations construct letters to go all over the country that deal with these issues, and our name and other organization names regularly appear on these letters. So that community is, I would say, pretty organized and of a single voice on these issues. And I know you all will recognize this. I don't believe there's a police chief in the country that think, for example, that we shouldn't have gun, what is it called? The 5-day waiting period. There are police chiefs who are totally against guns, but guns still manage to flourish in our society. And that's at one level, but we have been, as an individual and working in organizations, I've been involved in this movement now going on probably 40 years. When we were on the police force, we were talking about these issues, believe it or not. And, you know, progress is very slow. So from time to time, we see some results of our work. But by and large, probably the biggest mistake we made was thinking that somehow or another that this was going to get down deep enough into address the culture of the law enforcement community, and we fell short on that. It didn't make it. It didn't make the cut at all.
More questions? Right here.
Jerry Mohue, American University. We talked a lot about accountability here today. I think that was the overarching theme. Barry mentioned in UT, you know, they obviously talked about why they needed these, you know, things to protect the students or protect the people in Austin, and they had a good argument. My question is related to the structure of police in general. So we look at the military, and there's a high accountability level there, right? So if somebody does something wrong, there's strict rules that that person, gets busted down, and not only that person, but whoever is in charge of that team, is also held responsible. So is there something that we can do with the structure of police to hold the entire precinct responsible for the mistake of somebody that gets on, the news or whatever? So.
Well, I think, again, part of the police culture is that the internal investigative apparatus is encouraged to basically cover what police officers engage in as wrongdoing, unless it is so egregious that it cannot be ignored. So keep in mind that most police organizations, the internal investigative apparatus operates within the police organization itself. So it has a vested interest in not sustaining allegations of wrongdoing, in finding and unfounding, and rarely only will sustain complaints against police officers unless, and I said this earlier, the tone is set from the top down, that wrongdoing in this organization will not be tolerated, that police officers who act out will be sanctioned and follow through on that. Unfortunately, I think across the spectrum of the police culture, we have our work cut out for us there. Does that
Can I ask
respond to you?
Can I ask you a question, though? I'm just curious, my ignorance, and I'm glad to have two of you been great, and I'm learning a ton. So I get that about the internal culture and internal investigations. How does the culture run if the rules are coming from the top and then are violated?
The rules, well, there are rules that exist, and then there is the sentiment about how the organization is going to be run is what's communicated from the top. So the rules already exist, and they are they're immutable through the generations of successive leadership within that organization. It's incumbent upon the leader of the organization, the police chief or the police commissioner, to send the message that the rules exist to be enforced and that in fact they will be, rather than we are going to engage in business as usual and we've always done it, and that is that we condone wrongdoing and we will exonerate officers who engage in it.
And the problem with that is that those rules tend to be selective, because you will hear officers say, for example, I better not leave my beat, because beat integrity in a particular district is the #1 violation. You cannot violate that. But you can take 2 hours for lunch, and nobody's paying attention to you as long as you're on your beat. So, it's kind of crazy. But I wanted to, just for 1 second, take an issue with, it depends on the issue. Sex in the military is not an issue they wanted to fight. And they just can't seem to grab hold of it and do what they need to do. Sexual violation, that is. And so in policing, it's the same thing. It depends on what the issue is. See, if you were in New York City, and I'm just for an example, if you were in New York City talking about what the search and stop and search squads was doing, then there are people who would say that the stop and search was netting X amount of money, X amount of arrests. The citizens were complaining, wasn't complaining anymore, so that was the measure of success for stop and search. The fact of the matter is that when you weighed the results of stop and search, there was no comparison between the violation versus the results. There were violations. But what was important is that was coming from the top down. It wasn't something that some lieutenant or officer or sergeant was decided to do. That was coming from the commissioner's office, and to some extent even from the mayor in New York City, because that was an issue that they want to do. So you could violate people's rights, wholesalely violate people's rights, and wasn't nothing going to happen to you because they was going to rally around you and take care of you, because that was the goal of the day. But now, if you walk off your beat and you're not there when the sergeant or lieutenant passed by, then you were going to probably lose your job or risk losing your job, but you will certainly get some days off. So it's a game of issues in terms of what's important that day at the police department. And I know Tom has heard this before, but there's a saying in the police department: the more things change, the more they stay the same, and that's very true. And I don't care who's there, but every time somebody comes in, and it comes all the way from the chief of police all the way to the sergeant, that when that person comes in, he or she wants to put their logo on what it is that's happening, and yet the main goal of the day is provide public safety for the citizens in the community. But at the end of the day, it's all about that whatever that individual wanted to say, rather than the job of doing public safety. But it's a guesswork some days.
Can I add something on accountability?
Yes, please.
So I just wanted to add something on this subject of accountability. I understand there's a whole set of issues around whether the rules are enforced, right? And that's what Tom and Ron were speaking about. In this context, when we're talking about militarization, it appeared from our investigation that there's another whole set of questions around circumstances where there are no rules, or the rules, the bar is so low. So, for example, there is virtually no oversight over a police department's decision to deploy a SWAT team. How many officers need to be deployed, what weapons to bring with them, whether to use a battering ram, whether to throw a flashbang. So one can't even say that those rules are broken because there aren't any rules to be enforced in that context. And so that's part of why we think it's really important that there be not only internal policies and protocols, although that's important too, but laws on the books that put appropriate restraints on the police's ability to deploy a tactical team, to define the circumstances under which that's appropriate, to put some constraints in terms of the size of the team that's going to be deployed and the types of weapons that they should be able to use in the course of a deployment.
Yes, please, Barry.
So I mean, this is why I'm fascinated by police rulemaking. And, you know, people look at me and as though I'm crazy, and I understand that, but that is actually the model we use for all of the rest of administrative government in the United States. And so it's an interesting question why the police are different in the sense, I mean, Kara's absolutely right. It's astonishing the amount of space in which there are simply no rules over things that you would think government just would need rules. It's just, you need kind of some rules to run. And one answer to this is, and I still am stuck on this problem that you're just not going to get legislators to step up and do a lot of that work, but one thing that you could do is say to the police, look, you need to have some rules, and we're going to have rules just like we have them everywhere else, which is you're going to write up some rules for yourself, and we're going to have a public discussion about them, and then we're going to adopt them. And I'll say one other last word about this, which is consistent with my courts are terrible theme, which is, so the question is, what are courts good at? Well, courts are good at process, and so it's really hard to get a court to say to the cops, you can't do that. They're nervous about it. They're not sure that they know whether it's needed to happen or not. It's a different thing for a court to say, well, you didn't adopt the rules, or you adopted them, but you got a bunch of comments that pointed out that they didn't make any sense, and then you didn't do anything responsive to that. That's much easier for a judge to get their hand around doing as an enforcement mechanism. And I do think half of the story here is where do the rules come from? And then the other half is this remedy question about, like, how do we see that they get enforced? And that's tricky.
Hi, my name is Stacy Pace, and my question goes back to the first question or comment about the use of surplus military equipment in police force. And I think everyone saw it, Ferguson, big tanks, or what looked like tanks coming down the street, and it was scary and upsetting on a lot of different levels. However, now that I'm hearing you all, to me, it also has a lot to do with the people that are actually on the force. And while you can definitely withhold tanks and all of these items from folks that more time than not probably shouldn't have them in the first place, but it's also true that if you look back not that long ago in the 50s and 60s in the South, the cops then did not have these special programs, and they were able to exact a lot of abuse on peaceful protesters protesting for civil rights in the South, dogs, billy clubs, and they were very creative in what they could use. So perhaps the question, more or less easier, it'd be straightforward to say, no, they can't have these tanks, or maybe have a more intricate process whether someone could approve it or not. But perhaps a more ingrained issue is who's applying to the police force? Who are these people? Because at the end of the day, those are the ones that are going to be right there at an instant where someone is going to be making a split-second decision on whether to cuff someone, how much force in their mind they perceive is necessary when they arrest someone or detain someone. Those are the crucial areas. And especially when you talk about communities of color and communities that are with means and without, those are a lot of the discrepancies. It's nothing, as someone said earlier, it's nothing that's in a law, but even though it's not in a law, you can definitely look at how policing is carried out in poor communities and communities of color and communities that have means. And my question is there a particular kind of person that is attracted more to being a police officer than not? Or are there specific issues or qualities that police departments should be looking for when they're recruiting police officers today? Perhaps people that have an enhanced sensitivity to different ethnic groups. What are we looking for? I know that in DC, they do place a lot of, they have a test, but they also have a lot of physical tests as well. But to me, it seems policing is definitely, to be a good police officer, it seems you have to be very smart. It takes a lot of mental toughness, mental strength. And it's not all about being physically strong and being able to arm wrestle someone. So,
Tom, do you want to?
I think traditionally, people who have been attracted to policing as a career have largely come from the working class. I know that's where I came from. And they privilege a black and white view of the world, and there are no shades of gray. I have, this semester, I'm teaching all freshmen, and over half of my criminology students come from police families. And most of these folks are not, and my hope is that's why they're in college, is to learn what we need to have in police are police officers who are compassionate, who are empathic, who are sensitive to issues around sexual orientation and race and ethnic origin group. And traditionally, that's not what has been emphasized. What we have taken, and this has proven to be problematic in recent years particularly, are people from a military background. So if you can show up to work, do what you're told, look a certain way, then you're going to get hired. And if you can follow the rules, you're going to succeed. And if you look to examine issues around income disparity and social inequity and socioeconomic issues that exist, particularly in communities of color, you're not going to be successful. So I think your point is spot on. We do need to realign our, who we are looking for to become police officers, because it's a good, the career is a satisfying one. It can be very lucrative. So we do have the right, and I think the obligation, to demand that the people who are policing us are possessed of these kinds of qualities and not simply people who see a black and white view of the world.
I would just say, I'm privileged to teach at the University of District of Columbia. As a matter of fact, some of my students are here today. And that's one of the three questions I asked them when class started at the beginning of the semester. And one of the three is, do you live in the city? Well, what do you want to do? And how do you feel like, or do you want to be a police officer? And most of them, they don't want to be police officers. But the class is 99 and 9/10% African American. And when I ask them why, because I do, they relate the stories about how police treat them in their community and their experiences. And then this semester I have two former police officers in my class, females. And that is the subject. That is a good point about where we get them from. But I can tell you that we don't have a special place where we go get people to be police officers. We pick them generally from the general society, right, like you all in the room who decide that they want to do it. Supposedly the process is supposed to identify certain characteristics and traits of people, and then those that are going to be or can't possibly be well suited get selected. But every now and then people slip in under the radar. But that's where education and training comes in, and I always say education and training, not just the training part of it. And that's sometimes what the institution falls down on, the educational part. But there are some positive examples. I remember the guy that was in New Haven some years ago, and as a matter of fact, he got rid of the police administrator that headed the police academy and hired an academic to run the police academy. And it made sense, too, because the education academy is where education takes place. And so you ought to be looking at and doing different things in the police academy versus just 9, 10 hours of training every single day and all on guns and all those kind of things. But That's a key component. And lastly, I would say that's why we were hopeful about community policing, because there was a component of community policing that talked about the education of the officer, and that these officers would be doing different things. They would be doing problem solving. They would be working in communities. They would partnerships with community organizations and individuals, because that was the whole idea of expanding the role of police officers, but more importantly, expanding the role of citizens so that they played a key role and shared the public safety responsibility in their community.
Yeah, we have time for one more quick question right here.
Hi, my name is Doris Cutler. I just wanted to comment to something that Kara has said, but also to the young lady over here that asked the question, where do police officers come from and who are they? Well, I used to be one of them. I am a former DC police detective, and I left the police department because I felt like the department was a Band-Aid on gaping wounds. However, I have a lot of reasons as to why I left, but to her question as to what happens or where do we come from, I think the department and the training and what happens with an individual as an officer on the street has a lot to do with how you perceive how you do that job and what comes out of that. Because I worked in the 7th District in the District of Columbia, which was one of our highest crime areas, and a lot of the things that have been talked about today, I actually had an opportunity to encounter. And as a female on the streets in a community where drugs and crime was very high, and there were a lot of guns on the street and a lot of murders, when you encounter that and that's something that you face and walk into, it will change how you respond to people. And so I think that has a lot to do with, how officers respond. And I've always felt like the departments, especially our department, I always felt like the department should allow officers to move from one section of the city to another and give us an opportunity to police in different areas, because when you stay in one place for so long and that's all that you deal with and that's all that you encounter on a day-to-day basis, then your response to what happens when you go to work is going to be to that community. So, I think that training is an issue, and that going along with that is that you should have an opportunity to see the department across the scope and not just be locked into one particular area of the city doing one particular thing. And in regards to the change and what takes place is that's the society that we live in now, that you are dealing with criminals on the street who have military-grade weapons. So what is an officer to do? At the end of the day, you still have a family, you still have a goal to go home. And so what do you do when you have to encounter those situations on the street in a community that I worked in, which was predominantly African-American community, and that's what you're looking at every day? Should I not have the opportunity to protect the citizens that are in those communities from the same things that we're talking about we shouldn't have? And how would I do that if I only have a semi-automatic handgun and then I'm encountering somebody who's got twice or 3 times the amount of ammunition that I'm working with? So I think it's a lot that has to go into the decision that needs to be made on where we're going to make those changes and how they're going to be made, because those citizens are entitled to the same type of protection that anybody else would be. And would that make a difference if you're talking about changes to the agencies that protect our city, and you're dealing with CIA and Secret Service and FBI agents who walk their beats with those weapons? How do you feel about the change to that? And we're talking about just dealing with the local small communities and the officers who have that equipment. If a change is made, it's probably going to affect law enforcement across the scope.
Right. We only have about a minute, but I would like for somebody to address the issue of how do you identify need, and are there places where there is the need for this sort of equipment?
Well, I'm gonna say, I don't, I remember the discussion that was taking place when we went from a revolver to an automatic weapon or semi-automatic weapon, and the argument in the atmosphere was that the police was outgunned. This was an attempt to level the playing field and all that kind of stuff. The fact of the matter is that the police are going to always be outgunned, and they're going to be outnumbered, because that's the way the policing was designed in America. and it was designed in America pretty much like it was in the UK, that policing is this small body of people whose job it is to protect citizens and not to create a police state. So giving a police officer an automatic weapon or a bazooka to walk around with, it's not going to work, and that's crazy. So you can't expect that. That's not going to take place. But again, that's part of the culture, and I think Tom would agree that that's part of the culture. When that conversation was taking place, the Glock was the answer. But the fact of the matter is that you cannot. There's no situation where you can give a police officer all of that to somehow or another match what he or she may think that they're going to run into that day. I worked there for 24 years, and I did some. I ran into some situations, but a lot of those situations, having a bazooka wouldn't have helped me, really. It wouldn't have. I needed to engage my head and mouth and be about the job of working in my community and trying to identify the root causes to the kind of things that was going on and provide, with the assistance of the citizenry, the public safety that they were paying that their tax dollars do it in the kind of way that was going to be effective. But I just can't imagine that there's going to be that kind of armament in police departments, even with the military. I just can't see that because there's no need for it, really. I just don't believe that. So that's one of my students, and we have these discussions from time to time. We have these discussions from time to time, but I'm working on it. You can believe that.
Well, please, everyone, join me in thanking the panel for this great discussion.